Oh, how you doing there? Welcome back to Babylon Talmud too. Daf Tzadiyeh, Daf 95. Myself, the BavaMetzia, friends, your friends. All right. 1 second. All right. Here we go. It's another Geschmack Daf, of course. I think it might be a big one. It's pretty Geschmack. Oh, I just hope I have the koiches to do it. It's a daf that you can really get into, I think. All right, where are we? Okay, we're gonna start in daf Tzadiyeh Amud Aleph, about 4 lines into the page. Okay, yeah, what are we talking about? Shoyl, okay, right, Gneva Vaveda, okay, Pshia, okay, Pshia B'Bailim, okay, what else do we talk about? Right. Okay, got it. Okay, yeah. So Be'etzim, today's daf talks about everything. What do you Shoyl, Shemachinam, Shemasacher, what you chai for, what you put it for, Bailavimo, Bailavenimo, that. Here we go. So we're going to start in daf Tzadiyeh Amud Aleph, 4 lines into the page. Gneva va'aveda b'shoyel. This is a very geschmacka daf. What do you want me to tell you? Oof, it's going to take a while. The geschmacka ones take a long time. All right. Gneva va'aveda b'shoyel minolim. How do we know gneva va'aveda by a shoyel? What does that mean? What it means is that the pasuk by a shoyel doesn't say anything about gneva va'aveda. It talks about ones, right? It says v'chiyishal me'im re'eu v'nishbar omes. So all it mentions by a shoyel is ones, right? V'nishbar omes, ones. So we of course know that a shoyel is the most stringent and that a shoyel is chai for everything, right? A shomer chinam is betzim potter for everything; it just needs to swear. A shomer sacher is chai for gnev v'aveda, but potter for ones. A shoyel is even chai for ones, implying that, of course, he's chayiv for Gnev Vaveda as well. How do we know that? So says the Gemara, or frek the Gemara, Gneva Vaveda b'shoyel minolan. How do we know that a shoyel is chayiv in addition to ones, but also for Gneva Vaveda? V'chi tema neilaf mishvura umesa. And maybe you'll suggest, well, a shoyel is chayiv for ones, so memele he should oichid be chayiv for gneva va'aveda. If he's chayiv even for ones, which was sort of unpreventable or like kind of out of nowhere, or as they say in Hebrew, out of the blue, and he's chayiv, so memele is going to be chayiv for gneva va'aveda. So v'choshgein v'chite minelef mishvura v'meisa ma l'shvura u'meisa de lo efsher limitrach ve'asuye. But the thing is, I could argue that it makes sense that he's going to be chayiv for shvura u'meisa by ones, because in those cases, if the cow dies, forget about it. You're never going to see that cow again. The cow's dead. So okay, says sure, maybe it was unpredictable, maybe it came out of the blue, but it's permanent. So you have to pay, right? You borrowed it, you have to pay the lender back. You have to pay back the owner. Tomer b'gneva va'aveda, but by gneva va'aveda the efshel mitrach va'asuye. But by gneva va'aveda, if it got lost or it got stolen, you could theoretically, put up, lost signs, and then you can theoretically find it, right? So maybe by Gneva Va'aveda he would be potter actually. So meaning it's not. So you can't just say, well, he's chayiv for ones, therefore memele is chayiv for Gneva Va'aveda. Not necessarily. Ones is final, right? Shur Mesa is final. Gneva Va'aveda theoretically you could look for it and find it and return it. Maybe he's not chayiv. Like that which in the Brisa, v'nishbar omes. When the pasuk says by a shoyel that it breaks or it dies, en li ala shvura umesa. So all I know is that a shoyel is chayiv for onsin. Gneva v'aveda minayin. How do I know that a shoyel is also going to be chayiv for Gneva va'aveda. Omar kal v'chomer. It's a kal v'chomer. And this is the answer. This is how we know Gneva va'aveda by a shoyl from a kal v'chomer from shomer socher. Uma shomer socher shepoter mishvura umeisa chayev b'gneva va'aveda. Well, a shomer socher who is more lenient than a shoyl in that a shomer socher is poter for ones and yet he's chayev for gneva va'aveda. Shoyl shechayev b'shvura umeisa, a shoyl which is chayev for ones, well, eino din, then certainly shechayev b'gneva va'aveda, certainly he should be chayev for gneva va'aveda, and that is how we know that a shoyl is chayev for gneva va'aveda. That from a kal v'chomer from shomer socher. If shomer socher is potter for ones, yet he's chayev for gneva va'aveda, well, a shoyl who's chayev for ones is certainly then also going to be chayev for gneva va'aveda. V'zeu kal v'chomer she'ein olav tshuva. And this is a kal v'chomer that is irrefutable. It is rock solid. My ein olav tshuva. What does it mean that there's nothing to? That it's irrefutable. What refutation did you want to suggest that the Gemara is saying no? It's irrefutable. Don't even suggest that. What is that? What did you want to suggest? Well, v'chitema. Maybe you're going to suggest that you can ask on the kal v'chomer, which is Maleshomer socher shekein mishalem tashlumei kefel betoyen tainos listim mizuyin. All right, back to the old toyin tainos ganif kasha. Maybe you could say that actually a shomer socher is more stringent than a shoyl, in that a shomer socher could potentially be chayev kefel, whereas a shoyel will never be chayev kefel. He'll always be chayev keren, right? So, for example, right, because a shoyel is chayev for onsin, which means that if you have listim mizuyin, if you have armed bandits come and rob from the shoyel, which is ones, so the shoyl nonetheless is, so the shoyl is going to be chayiv, even though it's ones is chayiv. What's he chayiv? Is chayiv keren. It's chayiv to pay the principal amount. Now the thing is, a shomer socher is potter for onsin, which means that if listim mizuyin come, if armed bandits come to the shomer socher and bandit him, so then he's going to be potter. Now, right, he's going to be potter. He's going to be potter there because it's ones. Now he's got to swear that this is the case, and then he's potter. What if he swears falsely? What if he swears falsely? What if he swears falsely and then witnesses come and say, no, really, the shomer socher kept it for himself. Well, then that should be toyin tainis ganif. He should be chayiv kefel. And in that sense, you can argue that a shomer socher is actually more stringent than a shoyel, in that a shomer socher could end up being on the line to pay kefel, whereas a shoyel will always be, right, will always sort of max out at keren, at the principal amount. So afilu hachi, just like we said yesterday, even so, karna de shoyel adifa, still the sort of the default of the borrower, the default of the shoyel, which is that he needs to pay the principal amount, he needs to pay keren for onsin, makes shoyel more stringent than a shomer socher, who by default does not need to pay anything for onsin. And yes, if it turns out that he's a liar, yes, he might have to pay kefel, but if we compare the defaults rather than the sort of like exceptions to the rules, if we just focus on the default for a shoyel is that he has to pay for ones. The default for a shomer socher is that he does not have to pay for ones, and therefore you can't ask that question on the kal v'chomer, because in fact a shoyel is more stringent than a shomer socher, and therefore if a shomer socher who is more lenient is chayiv for gneva va'aveda, then certainly a shoyel who's more stringent will be chayiv for gneva va'aveda. Iba isema. Alternatively, another way that you can answer in terms of a shomer socher potentially being chayiv to pay kefel is kasar v'listim mizuyin gazlun Who? Alternatively, you can answer, listim mezuyin isn't a ganif, right? Kefel is halacha by geneva. Listim mezuyin, right? What's the difference between geneva and gezela? Geneva happens in secret. Gezela happens in public. Listim mezuyin, but he's not robbing you in secret. He's looking at you in the eyes. And therefore it's a gazlan, and there's no kefel by gezela, there's kefel by geneva, not by gezela. Listim mezuyin is gezela, so therefore it's not actually shaykh to say that there would be kefel there, and therefore the whole argument to say that shomer sacher would be more stringent than a shomer chinam, than a shoyl, goes away, because there isn't actually kefel by a shomer sacher. Fine. Ashkichon l'chiyuv. We're going to keep on unpacking this. Ashkichon l'chiyuv. Okay. Liftor minalon. This is so geshmak. This is really geshmak. Okay, so by a shoyl, so we know that by ones, by a shoyl, which is written in the pasuk, right? Vinishbar omes. So it says, by love einimo shalim yishalim, and by love imo lo yishalim. So we see that when we say that a shoyl is chayiv in own sin, it's not, yes, he is, but not always. He's chayiv in own sin if the owner is not there. But if the owner is there, then he's potter for own sin. So we see that a shoyl is sometimes. So when we say that he's chayiv ba'on sin, if the owner is not there, he's chayiv ba'on sin. If the owner is there, he's potter from own sin. So how do we know that the same thing would apply for a shoyl by gneva va'aveda? That by gneva va'aveda, if the owner is there, he'd be potter. If the owner is not there, then he's chayiv. So again, ashkechon l'chiyav. So we just learned from the Kavachomer that a shoyl is chayiv for gneva va'aveda. Now that assumes, right, now that would be if the, so now, liftor minolon. So how do we know, though, that there is also the fact that he would be potter for gneva va'aveda if the owner was there, right? So we just learned from the Kavachomer that a shoyl is chayiv for gneva va'aveda. How do we know that a shoyl will be potter for gneva va'aveda if the owner was there? Well, let's just learn it out from shvura umesa. That if by ones, right, that if by ones there is this distinction of whether or not the owner is there, so then let's say the same thing by gneva va'aveda, but ma l'shvura umesa shekain ones. But I can understand why we would be lenient by shvura umesa, by ones, to say that, well, if the owner was there, you're potter, because there was nothing you could do. It's ones. There's nothing you could do about it. But by gneva va'aveda, which kind of is let's say relatively speaking closer to pshia, right? That maybe the shol should bear more responsibility for it. So that maybe there isn't this leniency when it comes to, right, I mean, to say that, well, if the owner was there, then you'd be potter. Se'ela gomar mishomer sacher. Rather, we learn it out from a shomer sacher. Okay, well, shomer sacher is chayav for gneva va'aveda, but he would be potter for shomer sacher is potter for gneva va'aveda if the owner is there. How do we know this? Where am I? V'shomer sacher guf minolin, and how do we know that by a shomer sacher, by gneva va'aveda, by shomer sacher, he's potter if the owner is there? By bailav imo. Well, gamre chiyuva de shomer sacher mi chiyuva de shoyl. Well, we learn out the chiyuv of a shomer sacher from the chiyuv of a shoyl. What's the shoyl chayav for midoraisa? Right, the pasuk says he's chayav for ones, and by ones, by a shoyl, we say that he's chayiv only when it's bailav ein imo, but bailav imo lo yishalim, he's potter. So we'll say the same thing by a shomer sacher, that when we say that a shomer sacher is chayiv, what's a shomer sacher chayiv for? Gneva va'aveda. He's only chayiv if bailav ein imo. If bailav imo, then he's going to be potter. Malaholon b'bailim potter, just like by ones, by a shoyel, if the bailim are there, he's potter. Afkan, also by a shomer sacher, by Geneva Vaveda, bailim b'bailim potter. If the owner is there, the shomer sacher is potter. B'mai gomer, how exactly are we learning this out? How do we learn out shomer sacher from shoyel? If it's just, why not? Mematzinu, what do we find? Just like by shoyel there's this distinction, so why not? Let's say that by shomer sacher there's the same distinction. But I'll challenge that why not approach. Kideparchinon, shekain ones. We can ask like we asked earlier, that I can understand why there is such a distinction by ones, because there was nothing you could, it was unpredictable. And therefore it makes sense that we should be lenient and say that he's potter. Right, if Baal of Imo. But that we can't necessarily apply that to Geneva Vaved. Elo Mikra. Rather, the pasuk says by a shoyel vichi yishal vav mosif al inyan rishin. Well, by the parsha of shoyel, remember it's 3 consecutive parshas. Of course, when I say parsha, I don't mean like a whole big parsha like Breishish, Noach, Lech Lecha. Parsha like like a little few psukim in the Torah. So there's these 3 parshas, one after the other. The first one is Shomer Chinam, the second one is Shomer Sacher, the third one is Shoyel. And by a Shoyel it says Vichi Yishal. There's a vav, right? The vav is connecting it. Vichi Yishal vav mosif al inen rishon. The vav by a Shoyel means that it's adding on to the previous parsha. Vilamid elyon mitachton, and therefore let's learn out the previous parsha from the later parsha. Let's learn out a halacha by shomer sacher from shoyel. And therefore, just like by a shoyel, there is a distinction between bail of imo and bail of ein imo. So also by a shomer sacher, there is such a distinction between bail of imo and bail of ein imo. Between bail of imo and bail of ein imo. Bidyuk. That by shomer sacher as well, where he's chayiv, which is Geneva Vaveda, if bail of imo lo yishalim, bail of ein imo yishalim. Fine. Great, Givaldik. So what do we know so far, friends? What do we know so far? What we know so far is a shoyel is chayiv for own sin, and that there's a distinction between bail of imo and bail of ein imo. We know that by a shomer sacher, he's chayiv for Geneva Vaveda, and as we just said, there's a distinction between bail of imo and bail of ein imo. We know that a shoyel is chayiv for Geneva Vaveda from a kal vachomer from shomer sacher. What we don't yet know is that by a shoyel, by Geneva Vaveda, is there a distinction between bail of imo and bail of ein imo, again by a shoyel, by Geneva Vaveda. Ve'akati, and still, shoyel mishomer sacher lo nigmar, lo gomar. But still, we can't necessarily learn that there is this distinction by Geneva Vaveda for a shoyel between bail of imo and bail of ein imo. Because you can ask, Shomer sacher, that when it comes to shomer sacher, shekain potter bishvura umesa, I can understand why there is a distinction by Geneva Vaveda for shomer sacher, and that essentially we could be lenient to say that bail of imo lo yishalim, that he's potter if the owner is with him, because after all the shomer sacher is potter for own sin, and it makes sense that we could also be lenient by Geneva Vaveda to say that he's only chayiv when bail of ein imo. But will you necessarily say that we should go easy on a shoyel to make a distinction between bail of imo and bail of ein imo by Geneva Vaveda? That a shoyel is more stringent in that he's chayiv in for own sin. So maybe when he's chayiv for Geneva Vaveda, he's chayiv and there's no distinction between bail of imo and bail of ein imo. Okay, so then how do we know that by Geneva Vaveda, by a shoyel, there is such a distinction that he's chayiv when it's Bailav Einimo and that he's potter for Bailav Imo. The Gomer Mishomer Socher. Well, because I'm sorry, did I read that wrong? This is the answer. I'm sorry. Back up a minute. So Ella. Okay, 4 lines before it gets wide. Ella, here's the answer. Sorry. Here's the answer. Look, how do we know in the first place that a shoyl is chayev for gneva va'aveda? The Gomer Mishomer Socher. Well, as we learned out, right? We said this is a kal v'chomer she'ein alav tshuva. That if a shomer sacher who's potter for ones is chayiv for gneva v'aveda, so then a shoyel who's chayiv for ones should certainly be chayiv for gneva v'aveda, and then dayo lavo min hadin lios kanidon, and then whatever we're learning out from a kal v'chomer, meaning if we're learning out that a shoyel is chayiv for gneva v'aveda from Shomer Sacher, well then let's learn out everything from Shomer Sacher. Not just that the shoyel is chayiv for gneva v'aveda, but let's all, okay, how is it, in what way is the shoyel chayiv for gneva v'aveda? Well, we're learning out from Shomer Sacher. Shomer Sacher is chayiv for gneva v'aveda, and there's a distinction between Bailav Imo and Bailav Einimo. So also when we say by a shoyel that he's also going to be chayiv for gneva v'aveda, there's also going to be a distinction between Bailav Imo and Bailav Ein Imoy. So again, Ela Gneva Va'aveda, 4 lines before it gets wide, B'shoyel L'chiyuva Minalon, D'gav Mishomer Socher, and Dayu Lavo Minadin Lios Kanidon, Ma'Gneva Va'aveda the Shomer Socher, B'Bailim Potter. So just like Gneva Va'aveda by a Shomer Socher, there's a distinction between Bailav Imo and Bailav Einimo, and when it's Bailav Imo Potter, Av Gneva Va'aveda the Shoyel Nami B'Bailim Potter. Also when it comes to a shoyel, when it comes to Gneva Va'aveda of a shoyel, if the bailim are there, he's going to be Potter. Well, this is givaldig if you hold of the concept of Dayo Lavo Min Adin Lios Kanidon, that when you learn one thing out from another place, so learn out not just the principle, but all details as well. But if you don't hold of Dayo Lavo Min Adin Lios Kanidon, meaning that it would be enough just to learn from Shomer Sacher that a shoyel is chayiv for Gneva Va'aveda, but I wouldn't necessarily go to the next step to say that a shoyel is that there's a distinction also by shoyel by Gneva Va'aveda if it's B'Bailim or Bailav Imo or Bailav Einimo. So if we don't necessarily take that next step, well then how would you know that by a shoyel there's such a distinction by Gneva Va'aveda, whether it's Bailav Imo or Bailav Einimo? Elo Omar Kro V'chi Yishal Vav Mosif Alinin Rishon. Well, as we had said earlier, that the Vav by a shoyel V'chi Yishal, the Vav Mosif Alinin Rishon, that it sort of makes a connection between Shomer Sacher and shoyel, and it's a two-way connection to say Bilamid Elyon Mitachton Mitachton Me'elyon, and you can learn out Shomer Sacher from shoyel to say that there is this we learn it basically goes both ways. Bilamid Elyon Mitachton Mitachton Me'elyon, that you could learn out what do you say Elyon Mitachton, you can learn out Shomer Sacher from shoyel, and I guess first really we learn out, what do we learn out? Yeah, we learn out the distinction. Who's yelling outside? I'm so happy I have noise cancelling headphones. We learn out the distinction between Bailav Imo and Bailav Einimo from shoyel, and we learn, right, so, basically it's a two-way street, right? So by Shomer Sacher, we learn out that there's this distinction when it comes to Gneva Va'aveda between Bailav Imo and Bailav Einimo, and we also learn out by shoyel that he's chayev from for Gneva Va'aveda from Shomer Sacher, and then we can also learn out from Shomer Sacher that just like by Shomer Sacher by Gneva Va'aveda there's this distinction, so also by shoyel by Gneva Va'aveda there's this distinction, that we can just kind of like learn out the halachos of one by the other, and therefore just like by shoyel there is this distinction. Just like by Shomer Sacher, there's a distinction by Gneva Va'aveda between Bailav Imo and Bailav Einimo, so the same thing would apply also by shoyel, that there would be such a distinction between Bailav Imo and Bailav Einimo, and it's not learning out from a kal v'chomer, it's learning out from a hekish, right? Ve'ein b'shivin ala hekish, it's learning out from a hekish that these halachos apply. One second, I want to hear what's going on because it sounds like there's a real ruckus outside. One second. Oh, what's going on? What the heck is going on? Oh, it's my neighbor. Oh, it's two of my neighbors. Maybe they can keep it down. Now, moving on. It's a very geschmack daf, but it's a slow daf, but it's a great daf. Okay, everybody halt in a cup so far? I hope I'm explaining it decently. You really got to work through it. I feel like I haven't had a daf in a while where like my brain turns to mush. I'm telling you, that was like the norm for a good long time. Like I just knew from the beginning of the daf, like there's no chance my brain is not going to be mush in about 10 minutes. I feel like this daf has the potential to like mush up my brain. Like you really got to work through it. I think as I've said in the past, I think my brain is pretty strong right now. I had to work, like I think I had to work through something recently, and it's just like it's just nothing comes even close to as difficult as BavaMetzia. I mean, Ezu Neshech. I mean, what in life is as difficult as the Ezu Neshech? I'm a computer programmer. I use my brain. Computer programming is easy compared to Ezu Neshech. Once you had to work through BavaMetzia, you can do anything that requires braining. It's such a treat to have BavaMetzia. Wow, this is giving me chayes. This is mamish giving me such chayes. Okay, let's go weiter. Itmar, it was stated. Pshia bebailim. Okay, when it comes to pshia bebailim, givaldik, so we've talked about ones by a shoyl. We've talked about geneva va'aveda by a shoyl, by a shomer socher. What about posheya? So far we've been leaving out shomer chinam from the conversation. Now shomer chinam is potter for everything, but he's chayiv for pshia. He's chayiv for negligence. So, what about when it comes to negligence? Is there a distinction between if the owner is dar'in or nisht? Itmar was stated pshia bebailim when it comes to negligence when the owner is there. Pligei ba Rav Acha v'Ravina machloikes Rav Acha and Ravina. Chad Omar, one opinion is chayav, v'chad Omar potter. One opinion is chayav and the other is potter. Mandam chayav. The mandam who says that chayiv, even if the owner is there. Kasover mikra nidrash lifanav v'lo lifnei fanav. That the distinction, which is found in the third parsha by the shoyl, can be applied to the shomer socher, which precedes it, and there's that vav, that connecting vav. Was it vav mechuber? Is that a thing? But we cannot apply this distinction between Baalav Imo and Baalav Einimo that is found by a shoyl. We cannot apply it all the way back to Shomer Chinam, which is the first parsha, because there's no vav connecting the Shomer Chinam and the Shomer Sacher. There is a vav between Shomer Sacher and shoyl, but there is no connection between Shomer Chinam and Shomer Sacher, and therefore we can't. This concept by shoyl cannot go all the way back to two parshas back to a shomer chinam. So again, mikra nidrash lifanov, that this distinction between Baalav Imo and Baalav Einimo by a shoyl can be applied to shomer sacher v'lo lifnei fanav, but can't be applied to parshas prior to shomer chinam. Hilkoch, therefore, im Baalav Imo a shomer chinam lo ksiv. And therefore, the distinction of Baalav Imo, or when we say that Baalav Imo lo yishalim, that does not apply to a shomer chinam. Ufshia nami, and also therefore, when it comes to pshia, which is a shomer chinam concept, b'shomer sacher v'shoyel, when we apply pshia to a shomer sacher and to a shoyel, ufshia nami b'shomer sacher v'shoyel lo ksiv. And pshia is only explicitly mentioned by shomer chinam. It is not explicitly mentioned. Right? What does it say? It says al kol dvar pesha by a shomer chinam. It does not say that. It doesn't mention pshia by shomer sacher and shoyel. Hilkoch b'shomer sacher u'v'shoyel l'chiyuv asya b'kal v'chomer mishomer chinam. Therefore, how do we know that by a shomer sacher and by a shoyel they're chayiv for pshia? From a kal v'chomer, it's logical. Look, if a shomer chinam, who's the most lenient, is nonetheless chayiv for pshia, so memele shomer sacher and shoyel would be chayiv for pshia. Aval b'bailim, but in terms of this distinction to be made by pshia, liftur ab b'shomer sacher v'shoyel lo. But we cannot say that there would be this distinction by a shomer sacher and by a shoyel, because pshia is a shomer chinam concept, which we apply to shomer sacher and shoyel via a kal v'chomer. But this distinction between bailim imo and bailim ein imo, which is a shoyel concept, cannot be applied back to shomer chinam, and therefore cannot be applied generally to pshia, and therefore pshia is going to be chayiv whether bailav imo or whether bailav ein imo. My time I'll come kiksiv in bailav imo lo yishalim, because when there's this distinction between bailav imo and bailav ein imo, and that when bailav imo yishalim, bailav imo lo yishalim, a shoyel, that's specifically by a shoyel, and we apply it as well to v'ashomer sacher, ahanach chiyuve dichsiv behu behedra hu demichtov. So it's specifically, the distinction is only going to be by shoyel and by shomer sacher, by ones and by k'nev v'aveda, but not by pshia. Manda Amar Potter, the Manda Amar who does make the distinction by pshia as well, and says that there is a distinction between bailav imo and bailav ein imo. Kasover mikra nidrash lifonav v'lifnei fonav, that the distinction can be applied not just to shomer sacher but to shomer chinam as well, to parshas prior. Because Rashi, look at Rashi, whatever, the last word of 3 lines before the bottom and 2 lines before the bottom. Besmicho, right? Mikra nidrash besmichos parshiyas v'afal pisha in hekish meforish ben. Even though there isn't a explicit, vav connecting them, but still it's one parsha, but it's 3 consecutive parshiyas, and therefore you can apply the dinim from one to the other. And therefore, v'chiksiv in bailav imo ashomer chinam nami ksiv. Okay, and therefore, when we make this distinction between bailav imo and bailav ein imo, which is specifically written by a shoyel, but it can be applied to shomer sacher as well as to a shomer chinam. Tanan, we learned in our Mishnah, hashoyel es apore, somebody who borrows a pare, v'shol ba'alei imo, and also borrowed the owner. Hashoyel es apore, somebody who borrows a cow, v'sacher ba'alei ima, or he hires the owner together with the cow. Sho'al ba'alei, alternatively, if he first had borrowed the owner, I guess to volunteer to do some work, scharan, or first hired the owner, v'achar kach sho'al apara, and then afterwards rented the cow, but at the time of the borrowed the cow, but at the time of the borrowing of the cow, the owner was already working for the borrower. Okay, so B'etzem in all of these cases, the cow is being borrowed at the same time that the owner is working for the borrower. Umesa, and in any of those cases, if the cow then dies be'ones, potter, the shoyel is going to be potter because it's bailav imo. Ve'ilu shomechinam lo katani. But the Mishnah doesn't say anything about a shomechinam. So therefore we want to argue that shomechinam is excluded from the leniency of bailav imo. V'letaimich, but come on. Shomer sacher mikatani? Shomer sacher isn't in that Mishnah either. So Ella, rather Tana, Milsa, Dichsiva Be'edja, Katani, Das Midrasha lo Katani. No, that the Mishnah was only mentioning the things that are listed explicitly in the Torah, i.e., a shoyel. By a shoyl, we have this distinction in the Torah. But the Mishnah did not mention shomer chinam or shomer sacher, for that matter, because they are not learnt, this distinction is not explicitly by either one of them in the Torah. But don't make an argument from there that that there's no such distinction by a shomer chinam. Tashma, come in here. Sho'ala v'sho ba'alei ima. If you borrow a cow and you borrow the owner with it. Sachra v'sachar ba'alei ima. Or you rented the cow and you hired the owner with it to work with it. Sho'ala, if you borrowed the cow v'sachar ba'alei ima and you hired the owner with it. Sachra, if you rented the cow v'sho ba'alei ima and borrowed the owner with it. Af al pisha bailim osin milacha b'makom acher, even if the bailim are doing work aren't necessarily doing the exact work that the cow is doing. For example, if the cow is harvesting, the owner might be, I don't know, involved in threshing or something, winnowing, whatever. V'meisa, and the cow dies, potter, the borrower is potter, or the renter, whoever it is potter. Savrua Hamani Rabbi Yehuda, and the assumption is that this is Rabbi Yehuda the Amar, who says Soicher kishomer sacher dami. So we mentioned, right, in this brisa, somebody who borrows, but also somebody who rents. And if we assume that a renter is like a shomer sacher, so then be'etzim, what we're saying is that this distinction, this leniency, that if ba'alav imo lo yishalim, seems to be both by a borrower as well as by a renter who has the same halachos as a shomer sacher. So meaning by a shoel as well as a shomer sacher, there's this distinction. And this brisa is mentioning things that are not learned explicitly in the Torah, but learned out through expounding, because it mentions also the shomer sacher, who it doesn't explicitly have this distinction. And yet it does not mention shomer chinam. So here we have a brisa which is mentioning the leniency of ba'alav imo lo yishalim, and it's saying that this applies to a shoyel, of course, but also to a renter, and we're assuming that a renter is like a shomer sacher, so it applies to a shoyel and a shomer sacher, but apparently not a shomer chinam. Hamani Reb Meiri the Omer socher kishomer chinam dami. So says the Gemara, not necessarily. You could say that this brisa is Reb Meir, who says that a socher, a renter, is considered like a shomer chinam, in which case be'etzim what we're saying is that a shoyel, there's the ba'alav imo lo yishalim by a shoyel as well as by a shomer chinam, and of course by a shomer sacher as well. Alternatively, interestingly, alternatively, if for some reason you'd prefer to explain that this brisa is like Rabbi Yehuda specifically, well then, Kidmachlev Rabbi Baravua, you could say that, yeah, sure, the brisa is Rabbi Yehuda, and it's like Rabbi Baravua switches it around, Vitani, and he teaches Socher, Ketzid Mashalim, that when it comes to a Socher, what's his liability? Reb Meir Omer Kishomer Sacher. Reb Meir says it's like a Shomer Sacher. Reb Yehuda Omer Kishomer Chinam. Reb Yehuda says it's like a Shomer Chinam. So you could say, again, you could say that the brisa is like Reb Yehuda in that case, if you switch it around like that, and say that Reb Yehuda says that by a Shomer Chinam, there is this distinction between Ba'alav Imo and Ba'alav Einimo, and certainly by a Shomer Sacher. Yeah, it's an interesting concept. I'm not really sure what to make of it. Right? Rashi says Ibais Ema, I don't know, about 5-10 lines into the thin lines. Ukma stam brisa Rabbi Yehuda. If you'd prefer to establish a stam brisa like Rabbi Yehuda, Tfeimer Reb Meir more so than Reb Meir, so then you could say like Rabbi Baravua and switch it around and say Rabbi Yehuda is the one who says that shomer, that a socher is like a shomer chinam. Yeah, that is interesting. I don't know. I feel like I haven't really seen that before. That there's some kind of potential preference to say that a stam Mishnah, of course, is Reb Meir, but that a stam brisa is Reb Yehuda. That's extremely interesting. Okay, and now we get to the last major chunk of today's daf, but it definitely is a major chunk. But yeah, here's the next big push, which is going to be the opinion of Rav Hamnuna. Amar Rav Hamnuna, says Rav Hamnuna, Le'olam hu chayav ad shetei pareh v'choresh ba chomer u'mechamer achrel ve'ad sheyu bailim shas sheila ad shas shvura u'mesa. Wow. Okay. So I hope I understand Rav Hamnuna correctly. Rav Hamnuna Be'etzem has two opinions. Opinion number one is that when we say that the owner of the cow needs to be, right, when we say this, right, that Bailav Imo Lo Yishalim, that if the owner is working with the cow, so then the borrower does not need to pay if it dies. So, doing what? So says Rav Hamnuna, it has to be, the owner can't, as we had said a few minutes ago that the cow could be harvesting and he's winnowing. That would be fine. Says Rav Hamnuna, that's not fine. If the cow is harvesting, the owner must be part of the harvesting with the cow. It has to be doing the same work. You can't just be employed generally by the borrower. He has to be employed to do the same work that the cow is doing. That's position number one of Rav Hamnuna. Position number two of Rav Hamnuna is not only does the owner of the cow have to be employed by the borrower at the time that the borrower begins borrowing the cow, right? As we learned in our Mishnah, if he borrows the cow and then hires the owner, that doesn't work. The owner has to be hired at the same time that the cow is borrowed. But also, says Rav Hamnuna, he has to continue being employed until the time that the cow dies. He has to be employed both at the time that the borrowing started as well as at the time that the cow died. Not just at the time that the cow was borrowed. So again, Amar Rav Hamnuna says, Rav Hamnuna, La'olam hu chayav, the borrower is going to be chayav to pay Achetei para v'choresh ba, that when we say that the Bail of Imo, that the owner is there and that the owner is working for the borrower, it means in the same activity that the cow is doing, para v'choresh ba, that there's the cow is plowing and the owner is assisting with the plowing. Chomer mechamer acharel, or you have a donkey who's like carrying loads and the owner is busy with that. And that the owner must be employed by the borrower from the time of the borrowing, as we know. But he says ad shashvur mesa, up until that point when it dies. Amakasover. So we see that Rav Hamnuna holds Bailav imo akula milsa mashma, that when he says Bailav imo, it means mamish Bailav imo. The owner is working hands-on with his animal and that he's there the entire time. Okay. 1 second. Okay, fine. Masiv Rave asks a kashan of Rav Hamnuna. Sha'ala v'sha'al ba'aleo ima. Okay, this is the brisa that we learned earlier, that if you borrow a cow and you borrow the owner with it, sachra v'sachar ba'aleo ima, or you rented the cow and you rented the owner with it, sachra v'sha'al ba'aleo ima, if you rented the cow and you borrowed the owner with it, shala, if you borrowed the cow, v'sachar ba'aleo ima, and you rent the owner with it. Af al pi sha'bailim osin melacha b'makom acher v'meisa potter. So we said that even though the owner is doing some other work, the cow is plowing and the owner is winnowing. I don't know, or maybe the cow is harvesting and the owner is winnowing. I don't know. So my lab b'melacha acheres, that implies that the owner is doing a different melacha than the cow is doing. No, says Rav Hamnuna, when it says b'makom acher be'osa melacha, no, they're doing the same work. Elamai b'makom acher. So now do you explain some other place? Dikam marpe ve'ozil kam. No, the cow is, let's say, plowing, and the owner is not like, leading the cow per se. He's not hands-on with the cow per se, but he's out there in front of the cow, softening up the ground so it'll be easier to plow. So he's not like, he's a little bit ahead of the game, but still involved in the same malacha. He's part of the plowing effort. Seifa al gabo have reisha bimlocha acheres. But 1 second, the Gemara is not thrilled to give that answer. That no, he's doing the same malacha as the cow. He's just like, a little bit ahead of it, softening the ground. Because the seifa, that in the continuation of the brisa, it teaches that it's talking about where the owner is mamish hands-on with the cow, and therefore it must be that in the Reisha it's talking about where the owner is doing a different melacha. Let's go weiter. Let's go weiter for a second and read the Sefer, and then we'll explain everything. The Katani Sefer, that the continuation of the Brisa says that Sho'ala ve'achar kach sho'al ba'aleh, if you borrowed the cow first and only later hired the owner, which of course we know would not, right? You have to hire, the owner has to be hired at the same time that the cow is borrowed. But if you borrow the cow and then later hire the owner, if you rented the cow and then afterwards hired the owner, even if the owner was hands-on with his cow, mamish doing the same malacha that the cow is doing and helping the cow and being part of that malacha, if the cow dies, the borrower is chayiv, even though the owner was busy with the malacha. But since he was hired after the borrowing of the cow, so the borrower is going to be chayiv. So the point is, here's the point. The point is that we're talking about extreme. The Gemara wants to assume that we're talking about extremes over here. That we're talking about big chidushim over here. In the Sefer, the big chiddush is that even though the owner was mamish hands-on doing the work with his cow, about as bailev imo as you can get, still, since he was hired after the fact, the borrower is going to be chayiv to pay. And the big chiddush of the Reisha, therefore, right, just like there's a big chiddush in the Seifa that he's super hands-on and still the borrower is chayiv to pay. And the big chiddush of the Reisha is that when the owner is hired together with the borrowing of the cow, that when the cow is borrowed, the owner is hired at the same time. The big chiddush is that the borrower is going to be patur from paying if it drops dead, even if the owner is doing a different milacha. That's the big chiddush. So therefore, in order to have big chidushim in the Sefer and the Reisha, we're going to say that the Sefer is talking about where the owner is mamish hands-on and still the borrower is chayiv to pay. And the Reisha is going to be talking about when the owner is doing a different milacha and still the borrower is patur from paying because the owner was hired at the time of the borrowing. So therefore, it's unlike Rav Hamnuna wants to say that no, the owner is talking about the same milacha, just he's like walking in front of it. So Rav Hamnuna would say no, Reisha v'Seifa ba'osa malacha. No, both the Reisha and the Seifa are talking about when the owner is doing the same malacha that the cow is doing. But v'Reisha Rabusa Kamash Milan v'Seifa Rabusa Kamash Milan. But nonetheless, there is still a chiddush in the Reisha as well as the Seifa as well as the Reisha. I guess you could say Reisha Rabusa Kamash Milan. The chiddush of the Reisha is the afal gav de lav al gabo. That even though he's not mamish hands-on with the cow, but just kind of the same malacha, meaning the cow is plowing and the owner is a little bit in front of it, weakening up the ground. So it's still the same malacha, but it's not mamish like assisting the cow. Since the owner was already hired at the time of the borrowing, he's still going to be potter, even though he's not mamish hands on, but still the borrower is potter. The sefer abusa kamashmon, and the chiddush in the sefer is the afal gav al gabo, that even though the owner is mamish working hands on with his animal, came to lo avu bailim b'shas sheila, since the owner was not yet hired at the time that the cow was borrowed, chayav, the borrower is going to be chayav to pay. So the Gemara is not impressed, though. The Gemara is not impressed, meaning, as we had said a few minutes ago, there's we want the biggest chidushim possible, right? The big chiddush by the sefer is that even though the owner is hands on, still the borrower needs to pay, and the biggest chiddush possible in the ratio would be if the borrower is potter from paying, even if the owner is doing a different melacha. So Amai Yomar Bishlama Reisha B'Melacha Acheres V'Sefer B'Osa Melacha. Right? The Gemara says, look, I don't buy that explanation that it's all the same melacha and still somehow there's a chiddush. No. Bishlama Reisha B'Melacha Acheres. I understand if we're going to say that in the Reisha we're talking about where the owner is doing a different melacha. V'Sefer B'Osa Melacha, and the Sefer is talking about where the owner is doing the same melacha. Hainu Rabusa. That's how you have chidushim. That even in the Reisha, even though the owner is doing a different melacha, still the borrower is potter. And in the Seifa, even though the owner is mamish hands on, still the borrower is chayiv to pay. But Eli Omar Reisha v'Seifa b'Osa melacha. But if you say that both the Reisha and the Seifa are talking about where they're doing that the owner and the animal are involved in the same melacha, my Rabusa, it's not really that big of a chiddush. Idi ve'idi b'Osa melacha. Right, in both cases, they're doing the same melacha, and right to say that the borrower is going to be potter when the owner is doing the same melacha as the animal isn't that big of a chiddush. It's a bigger chiddush to say if the owner is doing a different melacha, still the borrower is potter. The ode, and now so that was asking questions on the first premise of Rav Hamnuna. Remember, Rav Hamnuna had two premises. Premise number one was that according to Rav Hamnuna, the owner needs to be involved in the same melacha as the cow, can't be involved in a separate melacha. And we just asked the kasha on that. But then his second premise was that the owner needs to be employed by the borrower the entire time, from the time that the cow was borrowed until the time that it died. But we have two brises which are basically teaching the same thing that refute this notion. Va'od, where am I? Va'od, Tani, we learned in a brisa, mimashma shenemar, from the fact that that the pasuk says, im bailav imo lo yishalim, that if the owner is there, then the borrower does not need to pay. Eini yodea, don't I know? She'im bailav ein imo shalim yishalim, so then don't I memela know that if the owner is not there, then he does have to pay. Right? If he's there, then he doesn't pay. So Mela, if he's not there, then he does have to pay. So So why do I need it to say that? Well, and if the owner is not there, then you have to pay. I already know that. Lo malach to say to you, that if the owner was already hired at the time of the borrowing, ein tzarich lios imo b'shas shvura umesa. Then the owner doesn't have to be there, doesn't have to be employed at the time of shvura umesa. Haya imo b'shas shvura umesa. But if the converse was true, that if the owner was there working at the time that it died, it doesn't matter. Tzarich lios imo b'shas she'ela. The owner, the borrower would only be potter from paying if the owner was there at the time of the borrowing. The Gemara is in a few minutes we're going to kind of break down, get more into the nitty gritty of these drushes. Mitani idach, and we have another similar brayso mimash mishenemar bailav eini moshalim mishalim, from the fact that it says that if the owner is not there, then he has to pay. And yodeh she'im bailav imo lo yishalim, then don't I know that if the owner is there, then he doesn't have to pay? So elamatam lo min bailav imo. So why does it say that if the owner is there, he doesn't have to pay? I know that already. Lo malach to say to you, kevin sheyotzu merishus mashil sho'achas bebailim umesa, to say that where am I? Bailav imo. Wait, what did you say? Elamatam lo min bailav imo lo malach kevin sheyotzu merishus mashil sha'achas bibailim, right? That meaning if at the time of borrowing the owner was also hired, v'meisa, and then later on it dies, potter, even if the owner wasn't there at the time. Tiyufta derav Amnuna Tiyufta, that is a kasha on Rav Amnuna, both in terms of his initial premise that the owner has to be working in the same work as the cow, and also his subsequent premise that the owner would have to be hired the entire time. No, he would just have to be hired at the time of the borrowing, even if he's not hired at the time that it actually died. Abaye Savila Krib Yosha, Mataritz the Krib Yosha, Rava Savila Krib Yonasin, Mataritz the Krib Yonasin. So now we're going to explain these psukim of the Baal of Imo, Baal of Einimo, Shalim Yishalim, and then how we learned that means that the owner has to be hired at the time of the borrowing. Okay, fine. Yeah, I think my brain is like starting to get slightly mushy, but not really. Abaye said. By the way, the rest of the daf is not going to be super hard. Cool. I think this one I think is going to be over an hour. I think. Abaye Savila Krib Yosha, Mataritz the Krib Yosha. So Abaye holds like Krib Yosha and answers the psukim like Krib Yosha. Rava Savila Krib Yonasin, Mataritz the Krib Yonasin. Rava holds like Krib Yonasin and answers the psukim like Krib Yonasin. Abaye Savila Krib Yosha, Mataritz the Krib Yosha. Here we go. Bailov ein imo shalim yishalim. So if the owners are not there, so then the borrower needs to pay. Time of the leise bitar vayu. The implication is that the borrower needs to pay because the owner was there neither by the borrowing nor subsequent, nor at the time of the death. Ha'ise bechada, v'leise bechada potter. The implication being that if he was there even at one of those stages, either the borrowing or the death, then the borrower would be potter. V'oksiv. But one second, the pasuk also says in Bailov Imo lo Yishalim, that if the owner was there, so then the borrower does not need to pay. Time of the Isei B'tarvayu, the implication being that specifically if the owner was there both at the borrowing as well as at the death. Isei bechada v'leisei bechada, but if he was only at one of them, either the borrowing or the death, mechayev, he would be chayev. So what's pshat? We have kind of conflicting implications with regard to if he was there for only one and not the other, right? Either the borrowing or the death. Lo malach, it's to say to you, haya imo b'shas sheila eno tzarich leos imo b'shas shvura umesa. What it's saying is that the owner would have to be employed at the time of the borrowing, but he wouldn't necessarily have to be employed at the time of the death. But if he was there at the time of the death, that doesn't matter if he was not there at the time of the borrowing. It's the critical element is that he was there. He was employed at the time of the borrowing. So long as that is the case, so then the borrower will be potter from paying. Rava Savila Krib Yonasin, Mataritz the Krib Yonasin. Okay, Rava learns the psukim. He draws the same conclusion as Abaye, but just learns the psukim slightly differently. The Tanya and Baalav Imo lo Yishalim, that if the owners are present, so then the borrower does not need to pay. Mashma, which implies the Isei B'tavayu, that the owner was present, was employed both at the time of the borrowing as well as at the time of the death. Umashmanami. But the implication would also be that the borrower would be potter even if the owner was only there at one of the stages. But the pasuk also says that if the owner is not there, then the borrower has to pay. That implies whether the owner was absent both at the time of was not employed both at the time of the borrowing as well as at the time of the death. But it also implies that even if he's only at one stage, the borrower would have to pay. These conflicting implications lead us to the conclusion that if the owner was employed at the time of borrowing, he doesn't need to be employed at the time of the death. But if he was there at the time of the death, it's irrelevant because what's important is that he's there at the time of the borrowing, not at the time of the death. 1 second, I'll switch it around. Meaning, why do we assume All we know from these drashas, whether Abai is drasha or Rav is drasha, all we know is that when the owner was there for only one of the critical moments, whether the borrowing or the death, when the owner was there for one of them, well then the borrower will be patur from paying. We're assuming that the critical one is the time of borrowing. How do we know that? Maybe the critical one is that he has to be there at the time of the death. He has to be employed at the time of the death. So mistav sheila adifa. Well, it makes sense to say that the critical one is that he's employed at the time of the borrowing. Mishum de kamaisi lo l'rshusei, because the time of the borrowing is the point at which it becomes in the rishus of the borrower. Adrab, I'll say fakert shvura umeisa adifa shekin chayv ba'onsin. No, the time when it dies is the important part, because that's when it's all going down. That's the critical moment when it dies. That's when the onus happens. Ilo sheila shvur v'meisa my ovid. To which you say, yeah, but if it was never borrowed in the first place, then what relevance would there be for the subsequent onus? V'ilav shvur v'meisa sheila my ovid. But then the Gemara counters, yeah, but I mean, if it didn't ultimately result in onus, then who cares? So even so, sheila adifa. The borrowing is the critical point, shekin chayv b'mezonosea, because that is the point at which the shoel becomes chayev and paying for its food and kind of takes responsibility for it. That is the critical part, but that's the critical moment, and therefore that's the part where the owner would have to be employed in order for the borrower to be patur from paying in the case of onus. Rav Ashi Omer says, Rav Ashi Omar Krop, that the pasuk says v'chiyishal ish me'im re'eyu. That it says that right, meaning that it says when a person borrows me'imre'eu from his friend, v'lo re'eu imo, but his friend he is not hiring as well. It says me'imre'eu from his friend, but not also his friend. Shalim yishalim, and that's where the pasuk says shalim yishalim, he shall surely pay. That if at the time of borrowing he did not at that time borrow the owner, then shalim yishalim, then he needs to pay. But if at the time of the borrowing he also had hired the owner, well then it'll be potter. Well then why do I need the psukim to also say balav imo, balav enimo? We learned it out from me'imre'eu. Well, if not for balav imo, balav enimo, I would have argued that when it says v'chiyishal me'imre'eu, that's just a normal way of writing, but don't get so technical. But once already, we have these other things to say that no, it does matter. It's balavimo, balavenimo. It does matter whether do get technical. That's actually important. Balavimo, balavenimo. This distinction, and we can learn out from Chiyisha me'imre'eu that it's talking about davka at the time of the borrowing that the owner would have to be employed in order for the borrower to be potter. Wow, sheesh! I think that was a long daf. I think it was over an hour. I think, and it was very geshmakadaf. Very geshmakadaf. Oh yeah, we learned. Oh my gosh, we learned such important stuff. We learned. How do we know that a shoyl is? We learned some mind-blowing stuff here. How do we know that a shoyl is chayiv for Gnev Vaveda? After all, the pasuk only says onsin. How do you know he's also chayiv for Gnev Vaveda? We're learning out be'etzim from Makav Chomer from Shomer Sacher, and then we also say that Shomer Sacher, there's this distinction between Balav Imo and Balav Enimo by Gnev Vaveda by Shomer Sacher. We then say that the same applies also by Gnev Vaveda by a shoel as well. We then ask about Pshia. We start some machlokes of Ravach and Ravina. I think that we had seen somewhere that whenever we have machlokes Ravach and Ravina, one of them is lenient and one of them is stringent, I think. But I can't remember which one is which. Oh, wait, gewaldig. Look at Tosfos. Itmar Pshir b'Baalim Pasuk Rabbeinu Chanano. The Potem Mitam the Cholecha the Pliger of Achav Ravino Alocha Gedivra Mekel Havagav Tavichum Legav. Okay. No, but does it? Whatever. But I think it had said who's the one who's Mekel and who's not. Okay, I'll have to look that up. Psachim. That's probably where it is. Psachim Dafayin Dalet. We'll have to look it up. Akoponim. So one of them said that it's that this distinction applies to Pshia as well. The other one says that it does not. We saw that then the opinion of Rav Hamnuna, who says that Bailav Imo has to mamish be involved in the same melacha, as well as he has to be hired throughout, but we ask kashas on Rav Hamnuna. And essentially we say that the owner would have to be employed at the time of the borrowing, and so long as he's employed at the time of the borrowing, even if he's doing a different melacha, so then the borrower will be patur from paying in the case of ones. Peace out.